Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ILCN webinar. We're grateful today to be joined by this exceptional panel and to have this event be organized by the ILCN Regional Representative for Australasia, Cecilia Revel. Cecilia will be moderating the conversation among our panelists today. So if you have a question for our panel, you can submit them using the Q&A function on your screen. The webinar will also be recorded and made available after the event on the ILCN webpage. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I'll pass it over to Cecilia to open the webinar. Cecilia.
Thanks so much, Robin, and lovely to be joining you all today from Melbourne or Naarm, Australia. Thank you so much to the ILCN and the Lincoln Institute for all the important work that you guys do to support and promote and enable land conservation across the world. We're so excited to be hosting this conversation today. As Robin said, my name is Cecilia. I'm the regional representative for the ILCN in Australasia, and I am so excited to be hosting today's session. Before we dive in, I'd like to ground us in the local. I'm hosting this session from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And today we're talking about how the conservation sector can engage and share power with and learn from the next generation in nature repair. And in doing this, I'd like to just take a moment, firstly, to remember that this question doesn't just stop with young people, but runs across all minorities within the conservation space. And secondly, that intergenerational knowledge about caring for country has been passed down right here in Australia continuously for tens of thousands of years. And so I'd like to pay my deep respects to the elders of this legacy, past and present, and extend my respect to First Nations youth on this call and all youth stepping into leadership who are continuing that legacy today. So part of what prompted this webinar was a really brilliant debate that the Australian Land Conservation Alliance annual conference hosted last year. And the topic was conservation is for old people. It was really funny and it was incredibly irreverent. And Kurt, who's on our panel today, was part of that debate. But it was also really thought-provoking in some quite surprising ways. Some of the questions I came away asking myself were, where are young people in conservation volunteering? They're really well represented across other sectors, but relatively absent in nature work. And what's causing the disconnection among young people with nature? Yes, we know we're all on screens a lot, and I read a stat the other day about Gen Zers being projected to spend nearly 29 years looking at screens in their lives, which is more than they will sleep. But are there other causes like access or increased urbanisation or inclusion in narratives? And why aren't young people more visible in decision making? According to the United Nations, more than half of the world's population now is under 30. Yet, at least here in Australia, only 1.5% of parliamentarians are under 30. And the polls are telling us young people overwhelmingly care about climate change, well-being, nature, but this isn't translating. And finally, I was asking myself, when land ownership is so concentrated within the older generations and young people are facing huge affordability crises, which bars them from entry to land and land ownership, what can the conservation sector be doing to enable that land access and ownership? So these are just some of the questions I was asking myself, and I'm so excited today to be unpacking these questions with 4 youth leaders in conservation from the Asia Pacific region. They're Kurt Jones from Australia, Adriana Bird from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Anne-Marie Reduva from Fiji, and Kimberly Go from Singapore. To all 4 of you, I'm going to ask you to briefly introduce yourselves in your own words and the organisations you work for or represent, and tell me from your perspective in just a few words what the number one barrier to young people participating in conservation is. Kurt, I'll throw to you first.
Thanks, Cecilia, and yeah, great to be here this morning. I'm Kurt. I am the founder of Coexist Australia. We're a non-for-profit nationally across this beautiful land. And we exist to get young people back out into nature and involved in conservation. And today I'm coming to you from the Sunshine Coast, where I live, beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country. I think for us, like what we're seeing is the average young Australian is just not thinking about nature. They're so disconnected from nature. There are so many things that young people are thinking about, the cost of living, mental health, connection. And I think what we need to do is make nature cool again. We need to connect people back to nature. And if we don't do that, well, then we have a huge issue.
Okay, Adriana, to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Cecilia, and kia ora kit, and welcome everybody. Yeah, my name's Adriana Bird. I am coming to you from Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My day job is I'm a senior policy advisor at the Ministry for the Environment here in New Zealand. But beyond that, I do a whole raft of different work across several youth-led organisations that work in social and environmental change. I've made documentaries in the past on things like this. I'm on the Aotearoa Women's Surfing Association, so I kind of come to conservation with wearing many hats. And I guess the way I wanted to start today in terms of the impact, the number one barrier for youth is by actually introducing myself in my native language, because I think it ties perfectly into a lot of what we're going to discuss today. So, ko Ngāti Rangi Nui te iwi, ko Mawao te maunga, ko Wairoa te awa, ko Adriana toku ingoa. And translated, that is, Ngāti Rangi Nui is my iwi, Mawao is my mountain, Wairoa is my river, my name is Adriana. And so I want you just to sit with that in terms of how I've introduced myself, identified myself, and my relationships to place to kind of, I guess, get the angle that I'll be coming from today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adriana. That's beautiful. Can't wait to unpack that a little bit. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Nisambula Vinaka Nwaya Maori. My name is Anne-Marie Randova, a climate change activist from Fiji, the founder for the Say No to Balloon Releasing campaign, and also the Young Eco Champions League Fiji. I'm 22 years of age and is a university student. One of the biggest barriers that
Anne-Marie, we lost you there for a sec. Do you want to just jump in and tell us again what the biggest barrier is for you?
young people. Yes. One of the biggest barriers
Have we got you there?
express ourselves is not equality and is not empowering enough to allow our young people to participate in conservation. Vinaka.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. We lost a little bit of that, but I think we caught equality, respect and participation. Let's jump to Kim.
Sure. Thanks, Cecilia. And it's nice to be on this panel as well. Thanks for the invite. So my name is Kimberly, and I lead communications at the Singapore Youth Voices for Biodiversity. So we're a youth-led group run by Youth for Youths, and we're also part of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is under the UN Convention for Biological Diversity. So a big part of what we do, I would say, is mainstreaming biodiversity issues and policy. And how we do so is by creating platforms to give youth the opportunity to engage in policy discussions, public consultation, alongside, I guess, initiatives for them to build up their knowledge capacity in those areas on biodiversity issues that they care about. So ultimately, our goal is to help more people, in particular youth, better understand biodiversity and find their place in conservation. So I would say the biggest barrier I feel about youth participation is perhaps in our context is perceived relevance. So I feel like especially in a place like Singapore, where I guess land conservation is a very contentious topic because land is very scarce and development pressures are very real for us, the concept of conservation can sometimes feel very abstract. So I think it's more about, not so much about whether people just care about whether I think young people care about biodiversity per se, but also where they can fit into the broader conversation and do their part for conservation as a whole. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kim. So relevant. Okay, so we've only got an hour today. Thank you so much for all of your introductions. What we're going to do as part of this conversation is unpack a few key threads. The first is how can we, and when I say we, I guess because we're speaking through the lens of the International Land Conservation Network, we are thinking about all of these questions as the land conservation sector. Of course, many of these issues go beyond that, but that's where we are grounding ourselves. So how can we, the land conservation sector, engage young people more effectively in conservation? And when they do engage, how can we support them better? How can we more authentically share power with young people? And finally, what can we learn from them and improve outcomes for our movement as well as for them? So we're going to run this session not in presentation format, but just in conversation format. It's a panel discussion. As Robin said, we invite you guys to drop questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to incorporate those into the discussion and or perhaps have a Q&A at the end. We'll see how we go for timing. And of course, please let us know where you're dialing in from. And if you yourself are a young person grappling with some of these issues, we'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's jump in. How can we engage young people more effectively in conservation? Kurt, if I throw to you first, only 12% of nature volunteers are under 30. So can you tell us a little bit about Coexist and what it is doing to shift this curve and what others can potentially learn from this?
I think the biggest thing for us is, as I mentioned before, young people aren't thinking about volunteering. They aren't thinking about nature. But what young people do need is they need community and they need to be connected to community. And, after all, if they're connected to community and nature, the impacts on their mental health and well-being absolutely skyrockets. We know that right across Australia and the world, there is a bit of a crazy thing happening where young people are getting out, they're going to run clubs, they're going to all of these different social movements because after COVID, people are starting to realize that really we need that connection to nature again. So the land conservation sector has this huge opportunity to build on the incredible foundations of their knowledge and experience and land, these assets, to actually get more young people back out into nature. And through the lens of connection to nature and beautiful places and wilderness, actually inspire them to then want to protect nature and get involved. So at Coexist, we don't really want to be an organization that runs volunteering events. We don't want to be an organization that runs programs. We want to be building a community and getting young people back to nature. So for us, for example, behind me, you can see a beautiful photo of a field and young people are out there planting trees. That was a camp out. So, we partnered with a private property and a regen organization. And, the marketing theme around that event was come out for a weekend, get back out to nature. We're going to have ice baths. We're going to have yoga. And it's all about getting under the stars and, sitting around the campfire. But at the same time, we're actually planting 2,000 trees during the day. We're doing citizen science. We're doing wildlife spotting at nighttime. And because, young people aren't thinking about that citizen science and that nature, we're advertising it through a different lens. We're then actually able to get this whole other cohort of young people that wouldn't normally come to a volunteer or a science event, but we're getting them through that connection to nature and community. And then at that event, we've got a captivated audience where we can actually educate and inspire and get them involved hands-on in conservation activities. Then meeting other people and then becoming a part of that community. So for us, it's like, how do we rebrand conservation? How do we, change what conservation and nature looks like for not just young people? And I think there's a very important thing here is when we're always talking about youth engagement in the environment and the conservation sector, I think we very quickly think about the young people that are interning or the young people that are ecology students or the young people that are passionate about the environment. But I'm sorry, that's not good enough. We need to be thinking about how do we actually inspire a whole generation of everyday young Australians? Because where I grew up in a low socioeconomic area, and I'm suppose other young people in rural and regional areas, they aren't thinking about conservation. They aren't thinking about climate. But I'm sure they love camping in their local national park. I'm sure they love going out in the boat on the river. So how do we start to change the way we think and communicate conservation to young people? Because it's not good enough to just get, young people studying environment university. We need to change culture. We need to change a whole generation. And to do that, we need to change the message.
Amazing. Love it. I feel as though, Kim, you might have something to say about that, about the idea that it's not just specialists in science and environment, in activism that can and should be participating in conservation. Can you tell us a little bit about Singapore Youth Voices for Biodiversity and what you guys do in this context?
Yeah. Um, I think I very much agree with what Kurt said that, I think but we definitely do take a more pragmatic and realistic approach, I think, for us in Singapore, which is I think ultimately at the end of the day, mainstreaming biodiversity for us also makes it how we see it through is just how we can make it a part of everyday conversations, and I think at least for Singapore, how we see it is it's very much like making it real. Like, for example, if you've seen that patch of forest get cleared, or maybe that park, maybe that forest that you used to visit is gone now, and then now it's just development. So then, how do we contextualize it for them? But I think it is also, um, I think something else that we are also trying to, um, I think. Sorry, maybe let me reframe that. But I think one of the things that makes us unique as a youth group is that we do give people from all walks of life opportunities to participate regardless of their background. And I think that's very important. I think especially one of the things that we tried earlier this year was actually running like a 3 day 2 days biodiversity boot camp. And then from that we kind of saw that people from different, I guess, walks of life, whether they are studying like ecology, I mean, or whether they are studying in fine arts. And we even got people from engineering backgrounds who decided to join us for like the boot camp. We just found that it was very interesting because it's also seeing how the intersectionalities can be played out, and like how you can leverage on all your different skill sets to perhaps find a collaborative solution to come together for how you can advance I guess, solutions for biodiversity conservation, whether it is, I guess, maybe influencing workplace decisions when they ultimately go out to work in their own respective organizations. So that could be, I mean, and that could range and look like in a different sort of things. It could also just be like small things that they decided to do, like such as going out to volunteer, or maybe they decided to share a bit more about maybe like historical anecdotes or bits and pieces about like how forest pieces are like in Singapore and why it is something that we should care about. So it's just small little bits and things like that that I think everybody can sort of play a part and do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if we open the door and make some of these ideas more accessible, as you say, they're actually traveling beyond the boundaries of conservation and into workplaces and into homes and mainstreaming, as you say. Anne Marie, can you tell us a little bit about some of the remarkable work you've been doing in Fiji? I'm particularly interested to hear about the mangrove planting work that you did and how you brought your community and in particular young people along with you on that journey.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. So December 1st, 2018, I organized our first mangrove planting event at the Silver Foreshore in Nasese. And we started off with 2,000 mangroves with 20 people, close family and friends. And from December 1st, 2018, till now, we've planted more than 250,000 mangroves along the Silver Foreshore and around Fiji. We continue to plant until we can't plant no more. And I think in engaging our young people in conservation is basically moving from abstract solutions to tangible oriented solutions and being honest with our approach on how we engage them. I think with my mangrove planting initiatives, we've tried to approach them with a more fun, humorous, and very islander style of engaging them. So whenever we have our mangrove planting initiatives, we always start off with a prayer, and straight after the prayer, we'll bring people into groups, and we'll do our mangrove planting. Straight after the mangrove planting, we'll go on to a beach cleanup, and we'll say, okay, the group that collects the most rubbish will win a prize. And nice to see how young people are very enthusiastic in participating in cleanup campaigns. And yes, I think it all deals with our approach and how we are very honest with our call to action, Vinaka.
Yeah, and a little bit like what Kurt was saying, you're bringing lots of elements to that experience. It's almost a celebration, and then the cleanup is a little bit of a competition. It's fun, it's engaging, it's funny, and then it's rooted in local faith or spiritualism. And I love all of that. It becomes more than just a cleanup. It's an eco-friendly celebration. So it's such a great idea. Adriana, do you have any quick reflections on this topic as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we're
Totally. And I
engaging.
think, yeah, I think listening to everyone else's words is really, I feel like they've all kind of stepped into that same theme of needing that rebrand for conservation, in terms of how we engage youth. And even in that sense, like I feel like the way we talk about engagement with youth almost is like engaging youth is something that we do to youth as opposed to something that just happens when young people are able to belong and participate meaningfully in conservation efforts. And I think, like everyone was saying, like that happens when we actually look at how young people are disconnected from land, the accessibility issue, not just physical accessibility limitations, but just the inability to feel like they belong, either through the lack of, the educational institutional structures that we typically kind of associate with conservation, or just because they don't have, the ability to connect with nature. They don't have that relationship, the void of it, either through the upbringing or whatever that might be. And so I think there's kind of almost a two-pronged approach to how we, I guess, remove those barriers for youth. Is a changing the brand in which we brand and I guess like communicate conservation, but also there needs to be a bit of a fundamental remodeling of conservation as a system. And I think a lot of Indigenous approaches to how we relate to land, as opposed to just this black and white conserve, protect type approach that tends to happen in Western conservation spaces, is really, really valuable when it comes to how we get youth involved. Because, yeah, youth aren't necessarily looking for causes to jump onto; they're looking for community, and I think that's how we do it.
Mm.
I love that, Adriana. Thanks so much. And you've had a little bit of experience in the climate space. Would you have any thoughts or reflections on what we can potentially learn from climate? Because, they've successfully mobilized millions of people to this cause, and arguably we're not succeeding in that way. And yes, climate is different. It's global and it has a centralized metric and there's all those types of things. And nature's sort of so local and arguably they're different things. But on the other hand, I'm sure we can learn from them. Do you have any reflections on that?
Definitely. And I think when it comes to that, I guess the pitch almost to young people. I think the climate movement has done that really successfully. Here in New Zealand, the School Strike for Climate New Zealand is one of the largest scale climate protests that we've ever had in the country, and it was completely youth led. And essentially, that was built from, I guess, bringing down the barriers to entry a little bit and making action or climate action much more approachable for young people, and kind of feeding in to the need to belong and the want to kind of be a part of something, as opposed to needing expertise in a particular area before you start engaging in it. And so I think that's what the climate kind of campaign, climate action campaign, did really well, is that they kind of tapped into this like almost fear of missing out that young people have, of like, this is the boat that we're on, like get on board, like this is our future. And I think it meant that people were able to join the movement without feeling that they needed to have some level of expertise. And I think that's what conservation needs to bring to young people, is that you don't need to be studying environmental science, or you don't need to be like an activist in your own right. Like if you like to interact with the living world, then boom, you like
Mm,
conservation. And I just
mm,
think that, like, by lowering the barrier, it's not making it less than, it's just widening the door for everyone to access it. And I think it's
Mm.
really important that we do that. And
yeah,
climate, yeah, the climate movement did that. Yeah.
yeah. So great. Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of giving people FOMO, and that's why they come and do nature stuff. It's very cool. So, okay, we've got a cohort who are engaged. The question from me is, how do we support them best? How is the land conservation sector and beyond supporting these people? Now, that's it's all the folks who want to do volunteering, but it's in particular maybe those young people who do step up and lead community campaigns or advocate for nature. And they're often doing that, with very limited funding and limited leadership and mentorship, maybe without structural support. So what can we do to support these young people to do what they do best? I'll let anyone jump in here. Who has some thoughts?
I'd be keen to jump in really quick just to offer a couple words, and then I'll shut up and let someone else talk. But
Yeah.
I think I really, having worked, I'm now 29, so I feel like youth adjacent is probably the word I would use, but which means I've had a lot of experience over the last however many years in different youth campaigns and organizations. And the word burnout is just like burnt into my brain in terms of just how young people who are super like passionate, who are already on that other side of, I guess, the fence of wanting to be involved in everything and anything and wanting to change the world. Everyone's so tired all the time, and a lot of the kind of support that it's often framed as like resilience training or whatnot, in terms of like helping young people deal with the world as opposed to actually fixing the conditions. And so I kind of offer that as a bit of a nod to being like, in terms of support, I think we need to reduce burnout by design. We need to increase real connectivity and community. And that comes through how we design the spaces that young people can actually come into contact with, rather than just build the resilience of those young people.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I might just add that's a really good point. But like for me, Cecilia, hearing you ask that question, I kind of reflected on my journey. And I suppose, I was a young person in high school going and volunteering in a lot of community groups, but always the only young person there. And honestly, you feel like you don't belong, let alone you're able to create any change. And I suppose that's where the idea of coexist sparked. And it was like, well, there is a niche. There is a need for a community where young people can gather to get back to nature and lead conservation projects like beach cleanups, tree planting, citizen science, but do it in a way that we are inclusive of all young people, whether you're passionate about conservation now or maybe you've never thought about it before. And I suppose, I was a pretty eager, young, passionate person that had that idea, that had that dream, and that dream was pushed back by a lot of organizations that I pitched it to, by funders, by councils. And the answers that we were getting and the responses that, well, you guys are too young. Young people don't want to volunteer. It'll cost too much money. All these things that really discouraged us, but in hindsight, actually really pushed us further because we knew that this was a cause that needed to really prevail. And I suppose, how do we support young people? We've got to put them in the right circles and we've got to fund them. And, we were lucky. Why Coexist has grown so much is the Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation gave us $500,000 as seed funding to start this project over 2 years. And, from running a few things on the Sunshine Coast every month, we're now doing 30 events across the country every month, engaging hundreds and hundreds of young people in community conservation. So it's like we know that we have to change things. We can't keep going the way we're going. We can't keep, getting conservation organizations to be putting on bio blitzes. And, you always get that same demographic of people that come that are already passionate about conservation. Not always, but most of the time. We've got to acknowledge that there needs to be a rebrand. There needs to be a reform where funders, the conservation sector, and young people that have these ideas need to come together and say, we need to change the way young Australians view nature, they view conservation, and they view the way young people can get involved. And until we do that, we're not really going to see the change. Because as I've said before, we can't just have a youth internship program, get young people to study. We've got to come together and say, how do we nationally create society and culture change to get more young people passionate about nature and out in nature? And I suppose it's kind of like that thing, 15, 20 years ago when there was a huge movement around we need to start talking about mental health. And now how mental health and well-being is so integrated into lifestyle and everyday life here in Australia. And then obviously that flowed onto well-being, to run clubs and yoga and Pilates, all these things. It sounds crazy, but it's very similar. Conservation isn't a sector. It isn't a volunteering organization. It needs to be a way of life for people. We are so disconnected from nature, and it's not supposed to be like that because we are nature. So until we fix that, we're not really going to see the results that we need to see. We can do as much research and as many bioblitzes and as many conservation volunteering programs as we want and as we can, but we need to shift a generation's thinking on nature, just like we did with climate. And that's what we need to do. We need to find young people that have the same views as the young people in this room. We need to get behind them. We need to bring them on our boards of our organizations to bring that fresh perspective and thinking, and we need to fund them. Because just like VFFF funded us, we've now created this change. There's so many other young people that have the same desire, and we need to do it. There's no time to wait. Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. We just need to take action.
Yeah. I love that so much, and it sort of taps into some of the stuff Kim was saying about the importance of mainstreaming this. It's not something that happens somewhere else. It's something that happens, everywhere in and through our lives. You also talked about, institutions. Do you think, I mean, this idea of sharing power, getting young people on boards, getting young people around the table in one form or another. We've got international frameworks that are saying this kind of thing, right? Kunming, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Explicitly calls for the inclusion of young people and First Nations voices in biodiversity policy. So we're getting that message at a high level, but perhaps what I'm hearing here is that it's not necessarily translating on the ground. What are your thoughts, guys, around how that can happen in practical and tangible ways? Anne-Marie, you've had quite a bit of experience both in the international context as well as very much on the ground. Do you have reflections on how the sector can more effectively share power and what any of your experiences, both locally and internationally?
Thank you so much, Cecilia. In the Pacific, we may not have the respect we deserve as young leaders, and it is really important when we provide a safe space for the upcoming activists and ways in which sectors could really support young people or even youth organizations is being accountable, transparent, and being very honest with their call to action and their support. For us, we cannot be talking about youth empowerment and trying to drive force with youth organizations to participate in conservation when they themselves are not really creating that safe space for young people to freely express talking about the issues. And as young people, we need to understand how powerful and influential our voices are. It may be a struggle, a challenge, but we are doing it for the planet, and we're doing it not only.
So thanks so much, Anne-Marie. You talked a little bit when we've had conversations previously around the idea of locally, sometimes it's been really challenging to do some of your activism work because you fear or there's sometimes repercussions around being judged and targeted, but that perhaps you've experienced a bit of reprieve in the international context, like when you're at the Global Summit in New York, the Global Climate Summit. Can you describe a little bit about that experience and how that helped you?
So during the Global Climate Summit in 2019, I met Her Majesty Queen Noor Al Hussein of Jordan. She was very encouraging and very empowering when I shared with her my experiences being a young woman in the climate space and the things that I've done here in Fiji. She was very well, she gave me a lot of great tips on how to approach people, how to network, and continuing to fight for our planet. I can also say culture, customs, and tradition is also a barrier as to why a lot of young people here in Fiji are not really interested in conservation or in climate change. It's also the fear of ignored by their own circle of friends, their families, and talk about an issue that is of nationalism, and we become threats ourselves to our leaders.
Mm. Such interesting stuff and difficult, particularly when we're talking about cultural or institutional structures, to work out quite how you unpack that. But there are potentially, you know, pathways for NGOs and other conservation organizations in elevating some of these voices when the local community isn't doing that. And yeah, thank you so much for your reflections and sharing some of those challenges, Anne-Marie. Um, Kim, did you have any? Oh, Adriana, sorry, Kim, just because Adriana, I know that you've been on the international stage quite a bit. You were the youth special advisor to the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, I believe. It'd be great to understand what your experience was around this, and what power sharing between young conservation leaders and senior decision makers might look like in practice from your perspective.
Awesome, thanks, Celia. Yeah, that's correct. I was the special advisor to the New Zealand National Commission to UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Science and Culture Organization. And yeah, that part of that experience was going to the general conference in Paris at the headquarters in 2023, and I was there as a general delegate, but I was also there as part of the youth forum, and as many of you can imagine, the United Nations is a very structured, hierarchical system, and so what sharing power looks like can be quite, I guess, bitsy. And I think a lot of it was done through quite meaningful dialogue and lots of opportunities to kind of be in the room. And so I feel on the kind of global stage, it's kind of providing those spaces where youth can access it. And I feel like from a United Nations point of view, I think that was the year that they finally started paying their interns. And like that is a massive part of, I guess, accessibility for youth, because if the internship or if the opportunity isn't paid for, then it's not about inclusion. That's selective inclusion, isn't it? So I think there's looking at that side of things, but then also kind of widening the scope to, I guess, meeting people where they are as well. Like there's kind of all these great channels that you can work your way through to get to spaces where you feel like you can have some kind of impact. And that's what I found myself doing by trying to, I guess, by weaving my way into the UN space. And then I kind of came out of it and realized that a lot of impact that really matters for me is actually on the ground here in New Zealand. And so I think that a lot of those in the New Zealand National Commission kind of saw that as well, and they do a lot of regional and local facing work here, along with their international work too. And so I think the conservation space has a bit of a unique lens compared to maybe climate, in the sense of that it can be very local and impactful, whereas climate is a big system, and so you kind of have a lot of that systemic, I guess, lens to it. Whereas conservation, the amount of impact you can have by just looking at a particular community or a particular group or just like a very small area is huge. And I think that's something that the conservation sector should really lean into, is that like that place-based learning, place-based engagement, because I think that's where a lot of that super like empowering work will come through.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. Kim, you at the Singapore Youth Biodiversity Voices, you've sort of had quite a strong international profile as well as a national profile. Do you have any reflections? I don't believe that maybe you've been overseas yourself, but any reflections on how your organisation is, contributing to sharing power? Any reflections on what that looks like and means for you?
Sure. So personally, I don't might have much international experience on a global stage, but I guess very briefly, I think based on what I understand from like my other team members who have been on the ground, we do actively try to work with our I guess regional counterparts from other chapters of the same, for example, with the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, to really, I guess, give youth that more opportunity to be at international spaces like this, and as well, not just to sit in, but perhaps also share their thoughts and perspectives and see what areas there are for collaboration in the long term. But perhaps I think I can talk more about what I guess authentic power sharing is like for me on the ground. So I think I think there's two parts to it, the way that I see it. So firstly, I think it's for the people who perhaps are really interested in conservation per se, right? Then how can you better effectively engage them? And I think one of the better ways of example, I would say it's moving beyond consultation to co-creation with youth. So I think something that actually I find it heartening is that at least, for example, the Singapore government here, we do this long-term planning, master planning thing called like the long-term master plan or like a draft master plan every 5 to 10 years. And I think, and I've participated in, I mean, once because, um, yeah, just given my age and all. But and it's very heartening because you get to see people from all different walks of life. So, if you're, as long as you're a citizen, you can sign up for one of these engagement sessions and just share your perspectives. Like for perhaps maybe I've met people who perhaps are interested in, have a passion for, I guess, boat sailing, and they really want this part of the land to be conserved. And I've also met people who maybe really love cycling and they want like more cycling routes throughout the island, for example. So I think it's really very interesting because then you get to see the different perspectives and what different stakeholders are at the table, and then also see how conservation, or I guess the bigger picture of like how you can sort of conserve that altogether while still being very intentional with I guess your development choices in the long term. So that's one way. And then I think for the other side, I think personally for me, because I don't have a background in ecology or environmental sciences per se. So I think one of the things that I really struggled with when I first started out was finding what is the right channel for me to participate or communicate, I guess, if I wanted to do something for biodiversity conservation. So I think communications is actually a really great way because that could take and look in so many different forms. So one of the
Well, do you
things
want to
that
tell
we,
us a little, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
yeah.
Because it's in a way that we can sort of move on to that. So thank you for those comments about power sharing. And I think what's really interesting about all of this is that on the one hand, we might sort of traditionally think about power sharing as, having a seat at the table at sort of major international conventions, for example, or, with senior politicians, but actually power sharing can take us right back to the original where we started, which is engagement, right? If you feel engaged and part of something, you have a sense of, you're grounded in a sense of belonging. That's a form of power sharing, and I really like some of the more localized examples you've given there. But just because you've mentioned communication, Kim, it'd be really great for you to, because you're actually head of communications, right, at Singapore Youth Voices for Biodiversity. So tell us a little bit about what's important to you and what sort of tools and approaches you're using to reach young people through your work.
Yeah, so I think when we first started out, we only had a Facebook page, which, I mean, by left, I don't use Facebook as a youth. So then how do I reach out to other youths out there? So that's when we started, experimenting. That's how we created our Instagram page. So I think perhaps Robin can show some examples on screen. But I think one of the takeaways that I've taken for, because we were talking about the climate movement, is that I realized that there's a lot of information out there about climate change, but there isn't as, or perhaps when I first started out, there wasn't as much information about biodiversity conservation and, things like what all the different complex like jargons and terminologies, for example. So something that we decided to do was this series called Biody Bites, which basically just breaks down like all the complex, I guess, like jargons to help people better understand how is the process like, that sort of thing. Um, so I think that that is one of the ways that I think I feel like communications can sort of really play a part. Um, I think another way that we've also started trying was maybe perhaps expanding that concept conversation. So I think one of the things that we're actually doing now is partnering with the National Parks Board to help them mentor like a group of youths under their Youth Stewards for Nature program to basically help them um, create like a short video series on remaking like what this Biody Bite series looks like in 2026 now, and what are some of the issues that we should care about or what some of the issues that we should talk about in that sense. And another thing that we do, I'm sorry, let me just go back on screen. So this is an example from one of our friends actually called The Weird and the Wow. And she does this really great infographics And I think this one in particular talks about land development in Singapore, particularly like this plot of land around the Changi area that we are going to lose eventually, and what sort of impact it could have on us, not just about perhaps the intertidal marine life that we could lose potentially, but also things like, how that would affect things like maybe sediment control or that comes into our water flows through the um, broader region. So, it's just small little things like that sort of add
Yeah.
up and how that could affect, like, I guess, local food supplies and things like that as well. So it's just like a whole value chain of impacts and effects that we see in the long term.
Yeah.
Um,
So breaking it down and I love the name BioD Bites. It's like bringing it down to bite-sized pieces, making it easy to understand, and to access that information. So on the one hand, empowering young people to access political processes like law reform, for example, but on the other hand, providing them with support around how they actually tell their stories and yeah, using really powerful visual prompts and so on. I really love that. Um, Kurt, I know that Coexist offers special social media training, so feel free to touch on that if you like. But perhaps, since we're getting close to the end of this session, we're broadly talking, I suppose, within this, so really, I suppose here we want to sort of unpack what we can learn from young people. So more effective communication is one really powerful thing. Um, uh, what else can we learn from young people? I mean, there's so much to support the conservation movement. Kurt, do you have reflections there?
Yeah, I just think on that, it's such an underutilized resource that, a lot of these very well established land conservation and environment organizations have is they have, a marketing team, they have a comms team, but
Mm,
yet, you know, they aren't reaching young people. It doesn't really make sense. So I think, by bringing young people in to actually help drive some of this social media stuff, and for us at Coexist, like we've got a relatively small Instagram following, probably about 20,000 across all of our pages, but that's relatively small. And
mm,
the engagement that we've got out of that is very huge. It's very tangible impact on the ground. So, one of the easiest things that these organizations could start doing is actually just getting a young person in and paying them because it's very tokenistic to get the young person to volunteer to do the social media, but actually employing, young people that are real guns on social media and content creation and start
mm,
to communicate your message and your work and your impact to young people, but have young people the face. Because obviously that is then going to reach young people. Young people are going to be more able to relate to those communications. So, very quickly, a lot of these organizations could be engaging young people. You've just got to
mm.
change the way you communicate and put young people at the center of the story.
Yeah.
And other things that we can learn from young people is I've had the privilege to be on a few boards over the last couple of years, and I think some of the changes that we've seen in some of these organizations are actually quite huge, quite transformative, because I bring different perspectives than what a lot of older board members would bring in terms of the way that we should be communicating stuff and the way that programs should be more accessible and the way that we should be designing things and even the way that we should be thinking in terms of governance. Like, are we designing things for people or are we actually designing things with people?
Mm,
And for to coexist, one of the biggest things, and obviously, we definitely don't have it perfect. We're on a journey, but I think a lot of the time volunteers are in organizations because volunteers want to make a difference. Maybe they're retired, maybe they want to go look after their local patch of bushland. But in well-established organizations, volunteers are mostly there because shit needs to get done, and we need volunteers because we don't have endless budgets to undertake work. But I think what I would like to see, especially with young people at Coexist, is how do we start to flip that? How do we actually provide more value back to the young person than they give
mm,
us by running 2 community events a
mm,
month? So is it upskilling them in grant management and writing? Is it, social media and content creation? Is it giving them governance training? Is it bringing them all together once a year to do a national leaders retreat, which we did for the first time this year, which was incredible? Is it sending them overseas to immerse themselves in a conservation program in South Africa? Different things that we're looking at, but how do we then provide more more value back to the young person, because you know, there's lots of conversations I'm having at the moment where we've got, you know, the sector of, you know, environment and conservation, and the young people that are in those sectors, they're very passionate about the work, whether it's land restoration, whether it's research, whether it's advocacy. But there's also another thing where we're actually lacking leaders in young people. Like, we need to make sure that we have leaders ready to take over the workforce and the sector. So how do we not just empower these young people to do the things they love, but how do we start to actually give skills and opportunities to the young people that do have that leadership potential and that appetite to step up? How do we actually get them, you know, ready to lead change, and not just for our organizations, but for them to feel more confident to go out in their communities and drive change? These really important skills that, you know, young people need to actually be leading the way. And I think that is so very important for the work that we're doing. It's really easy to, you know, bring young people into your board or to get them to volunteer. But I think we actually need to start to think, well, you know, like, look at the young people that are on this webinar this morning, the reoccurring theme of changing the perspective, you know, rebranding conservation. How do we identify those young people right now in Australia and around Asia Pacific, get behind them, give them the skills, give them the backing, give them the funding, and actually start to create this, you know, actual global, you know, reform about connection to nature, and how, you know, we obviously need to be looking after our planet for future generations. But it's not this separate sector. It's not an
Yeah.
activity that you do on the weekend. It is a way of life.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
Yeah, so important, Kurt. And yeah, that idea of bringing value to the young person who's actually participating in this process is super powerful. I wanted to come back to you, Adriana, and the barrier that you identified, which was really beautiful, but sort of essentially grounded in the idea of First Nations knowledge and perhaps the absence thereof within the conservation sector. What do you think we can learn, you know, as a proud Maori woman, from Indigenous youth and Indigenous culture more broadly?
Yeah, I think, and it kind of centers around a lot of what we've been talking about, is that relationship-based approach to how we look at conservation is, you know, there's a great quote from, I think it's a botanist, I've just forgotten her name, but it's basically like, how can we be expected to fall in love with the world if we can't pick berries? And it's essentially just, how are we able to protect something that we're not connected to? And a lot of people, like, I guess our generation has grown up in that kind of like convenience culture, you know, lifestyle, where, you know, the idea is that you go to the supermarket and you get everything you need. And now it's almost on a 180, where me and my friends are like absolutely stoked if we get to like catch our own food, hunt for our own food, grow our own vegetables. And it's really kind of done this full 180 thing. And I think that's where a lot of like I think, and Kurt actually kind of touched on this with that whole tokenistic view of like youth involvement and stuff. And I think particularly for Indigenous youth, but just youth in general, and also just Indigenous knowledge in general, rather than looking at things as youth perspectives or cultural insights, it's understanding that these offer fundamental, like a fundamentally different model of how to do conservation, and one that brings everyone along. And so I think that's a really important message to kind of leave everyone with, is that but there's actually just other ways to do things, and that actually kind of tap into spaces that we haven't necessarily accessed before. And one other thing that I'll kind of almost segue into on that note, and when we're kind of talking about the what do we learn, or how can we bring in young people who are already doing this, and especially from that communications approach as well. Social media is our platform, and it's the platform that we're socially isolated, but we're digitally connected. And I think that's the place that we need to reach young people on, meet them where they are, kinds of things. And I think there's this whole kind of mentality of influencers just being, you know, marketers or whatever it is. But there's actually many examples of influencers who are essentially modern knowledge holders and modern knowledge carriers in the conservation space. There's so many examples here in Aotearoa of Indigenous youth who have heaps of followers on Instagram or TikTok, who are essentially just using their space online to share their mātauranga, which is their Māori way of their Māori knowledge and how they interact with the environment, with their followers. And that's conservation education in a nutshell. And it's short form media, and it's super interesting, and it relates to place. And I think there's so many examples of this happening, and we just kind of need to partner with these people and boost that up, because I think that's a really really impactful way to go about things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely love that, Adriana. It's so true. We need to be, I mean, we need to be tapping into that power and energy and expertise and different ways of actually looking and thinking about stuff. But ride the coattails, honestly. I mean, we're not doing a great job of it. So let's work with the people that are if they're willing to work with us. We're getting close to the end. If we'll have time for a couple of minutes of Q&A, but just to close sort of on the formal bit of things, I'll just perhaps throw to Anne-Marie for any last reflections on, what you think the conservation sector can learn from young people. And I'd love to hear a little bit about, you started so young, you always championed your own activism. You saw the fact that people under 18 in your community weren't being heard, and you suddenly had more than 1,000 young people joining your movement. Do you have any advice on how to start these types of impactful campaigns and what the broader community can learn from that?
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Um, well, you don't need to campaign with a huge funding like I did. I'm not rich and I don't come from a rich family, but with the small money that my mom was able to put aside for our mangrove planting activities, and that was transportation, reusable and degradable garbage bags, gloves, and also a light refreshment so that everybody could enjoy the event. And creating the Young Eco Champions League Fiji was to sort of create that safe space for children under the ages of 18. Because when we talk about, when we look at children under the ages of 18, when they talk about issues that are important to them, they are always overlooked and ignored. So establishing the Young Eco Champions League sort of helped me come out of my comfort zone. Growing up, I was a very introverted young girl to the point where my mom had to order food for me at the restaurants, which was very annoying to her. Yes. And I've witnessed a lot of the young kids that have joined that movement champion their own activism spaces, which I'm really proud of. Also, mentoring them helps me to understand them better. They're also helping me, I'm helping them. So it is about networking and appreciating the efforts that they do.
Hmm.
And yes,
Yeah.
Bianca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, which, I mean, these reflections also tell us that some of the problems are really, really big, but, well, they're all big problems, but fixing them doesn't have to involve, changing the entire system first. And it's great to remember that and great to know that young people are doing this sort of work on the ground. I am realizing now that we're getting pretty close to the end. So I think we're going to have to, we've just got one question there, but I think actually I might just sum up so that everyone can jump off at 10:30. Look, I just want to thank you all so much. It's been such a rich discussion. I'd love to just feedback some of the key threads and ideas that we've unpacked here. And, hopefully everybody on this call can think these through and explore ways to take them forward. And like I flagged, some of the problems are simple fixes. Some of them are structural issues and cultural issues, and we need to acknowledge that. We're not going to fix it all overnight. But the biggest thing that's come through today is that the land conservation sector and conservation as an idea isn't currently speaking the language of young people. And if we're serious about capturing a wider audience, conservation needs a rebrand. As Kurt said, make nature cool again. It needs to feel accessible, it needs to feel relatable and local, and young people need to be the face of that. Underpinning this is the idea of grounding our work in community, mainstreaming the idea of nature action, turning the abstract into the tangible. And, a big idea that Adriana shared beautifully with us is the idea of how the youth climate movement has a lot to teach us. They did this rebrand that we're talking about here. They focused on building community rather than getting caught up in establishing expert credibility. They made climate action approachable and fun. It was part of, it was like being part of a social movement, this whole FOMO stuff that we touched on, and it was youth-led and youth-governed. So let's also remember to turn our eyes to this really substantial movement that's running alongside ours. Access is really important. We can't ask young people to protect and love what they don't know. And so let's look at the opportunities to get young people onto land that they don't necessarily own, enable stewardship, gift it back to them. Let's learn from the land back movement. Accessibility is more than just land access as well. It's about feeling welcome. So it's that open door idea. It's the sense of belonging. So that means, on the one hand, potentially looking at institutional structures, but on the other, looking at simple ways to create safe spaces. The other idea is that young people today are more disconnected from nature than ever before, and also experiencing, acute eco-anxiety, understandably. And our sector can play a role in helping to rebuild this connection, give young people a sense of agency in fixing problems rather than leaving them sort of in a vortex feeling helpless. Again, Adriana, you said something really great around young people not just looking for causes, but wanting connection. And that was a thread that really came through. Young people want to feel connected. And that, of course, is in turn a pathway to mental well-being. Respect is also incredibly important, something that Anne-Marie picked up on, and this can be a cultural challenge, but what can we do to validate and recognise the voices of young people, particularly if they're not necessarily getting that from their local community? We need to better support young people in all sorts of different ways. Let's pay them. Let's give them funding to actually enliven their ideas. Let's provide mentoring. Let's provide employment, time, resources. There are so many opportunities. And when young, energized people come to you with ideas, let's listen to them and prevent things like burnout. And not ask them to fix themselves and do their resilience training, but rather think about the way in which the system is designed so that it works for them and brings value to them. Because there's probably only so many times we can ask them to do free beach cleanups and tree plantings. Sharing power. This was a really interesting one because it's not just about seats at the table. It's about engagement, again, right at all levels of government and all levels of our community. And it's also in making young people feel comfortable with participating without being perfect, without knowing it all yet, because how can they know it all? They're young. So that was a really, really powerful idea. And finally, we can learn so much from young people. They have extraordinary communication and technical skills. They've got creative ideas. They think about stuff differently, and they have energy to burn. They've got way more energy than older people. And they're reframing how we're talking about some of these issues, and we should be paying attention. And if for no other reason, that they have the biggest stake in this story. So I hope you've all enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And I'm really looking forward to taking some of these ideas forward in the future. Thank you all.